This is my 2006 Bluebird Vision with a Cat C7 engine, air ride and air brakes. I bought it in September of 2023 for the low price of $2,500 and I'm going to convert it into my own personal permanent home. It may seem cliche, but when I first started this project, I had expectations of how this project may go. Let me tell you, this was very different from what I expected. When you watch videos of people doing bus conversions like I have, there are a lot of details that most seem to gloss over. And so, when I made the spontaneous decision to document my journey converting my own bus, I decided that I wanted to show the things that no one else seems to. I don't have the best video equipment or the highest level of editing proficiency, so I'm honored that you chose to take the time to watch my silly little channel, and I hope you enjoy every minute. We start this week with the removal of the seats. This was relatively easy to do and it might seem intimidating at first, but trust me, once you get started, progress comes easily. To remove the seats on my bus, the wall side of the seats was bolted to what I call the seat rail. I used a 1/2-inch wrench and a socket on a rattle gun to remove them. That was the easy part. The hard part was getting the bolts out of the floor. First, I removed the metal strips that ran down the length of the center aisle. This was quite easy to do as they were not held on very well, so I ended up just pulling them up with my hands. I did this to make removing the bolts from the seats much easier. Some of these bolts I was able to use a socket to get them out, but for most I had to resort to the grinder with a cutting blade because the bolts were so badly rusted that there was realistically no way to get them out any other way. One of the issues I ran into was this heater. It was fastened to the underside of one of the seats and I had no idea how to remove it. Luckily, it was just a matter of removing a bunch of bolts and sliding it out from the seat frame, and it came out no problem, though it was still connected to the coolant hoses that ran to the engine, which I will address shortly. By plugging away at it, it only took me a day before all the seats were out. That was the easy part. Next, I had to figure out how to remove the rear heater. First, I removed the metal cover that protected the coolant lines that ran the length of the bus. Once that was done, I removed the hose clamps that held the coolant hoses onto the heater. I used a screwdriver to pry the hoses off the fittings. This was more difficult than it had any right to be, and I ended up making a big mess all over the floor of the bus despite using a bucket. I drained the hoses as best I could, making sure to keep as much of the coolant as I could, and I put the heater core on the steel pile. After that, I removed this inline circulation pump, and as a temporary measure, I cut the coolant lines short and used the pump to make the loop smaller so that the hoses would be out of my way. Once I'd gotten the floors relatively clean, it was time to remove the vinyl flooring. This stuff was in pretty bad condition, so it was fairly easy to remove with a little bit of elbow grease, a utility knife, and a crowbar. On the wheel wells, the vinyl was held on with glue and these metal strips with screws through them, so I grabbed the grinder and cut them off. Once that was all done, I took all the loose vinyl to the dump and swept up the floors to make the next step easier. I wanted to pull up the plywood on the floors, but before I could do that, I needed to remove some of these strip pieces so that I could access the edge of the plywood. So I'd seen people on YouTube using car jacks to help pull up plywood, and I thought I'd give it a try. I started at the front, and once I'd gotten access to the underside of the plywood, I made a cut just behind the driver's seat area to make my job easier. Now this looks easy on video, but I promise you, this job was no fun. The car jack definitely helped, but the wood on my bus was so rotten that instead of just lifting the sheets as a whole, they kept splintering and coming apart in smaller pieces, which made the job take a lot longer. But I persevered, and eventually I'd gotten all the plywood removed, though this exposed some rust holes around the wheel wells that I would have to address in the future. Now that the plywood was out, it was time to remove the metal panels on the interior of the bus. I started at the back, which was mostly held in with Phillips head screws, but once I'd gotten the first few panels off, I realized that there were quite a few plastic trim pieces and a number of metal brackets that would have to be removed before I could continue. Luckily, these were relatively easy to remove, and it wasn't long before I was ready to start popping rivets. I became intimately familiar with rivets over the course of this project because there were quite literally thousands to remove and replace. The easiest way I found to remove them was to use an air chisel with the sharpened flat bit on it. I would put the bit under the head of the rivet and pull the trigger. Most of the rivets came off fairly easily, though there were a number that I ended up cutting in half first with the grinder and cutoff wheel. I worked back to front, removing the ceiling panels and pulling out any insulation as I went. By the way, I should have been wearing a dust mask during this job. The insulation found in buses is nasty stuff, and as I was removing it, it was throwing particles into the air. It was definitely not healthy, and I had a bit of a cough for the next few days after doing this. I learned the hard way, and I'm cautioning you to not make the same mistakes that I did. The ceiling of this bus had an emergency exit in it, which was blocking me from removing the sheets of metal from around it. I removed the screws that were holding the outer ring in place and popped it down on the gas struts. After that, I removed the bolts that were connecting the gas struts to the outer ring. This allowed me to leave the emergency hatch in place while still being able to pull down the metal from around it. I did put the ring back in place afterwards so that the wind wouldn't blow the emergency hatch away, and so that it could still be used to stop any precipitation from coming in through the open hole. Once that was taken care of, I continued to work my way to the front of the bus, taking down all the metal ceiling panels. The front panel was just a matter of undoing all the screws holding it in, and it popped out rather easily. By the way, did you know that I have a second channel? It's called Cinebeam, and it primarily focuses on gaming content, so if you're into that, feel free to give it a look. I'll put a link in the description below. And that's all for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you're feeling so inclined, I would appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe to my channel. It's by no means mandatory, but I would love to make YouTube into a full-time career if I can, so every bit helps. Enjoy your day, and I'll see you in the next one.